I will also be giving a brief overview of what is Australia to the white European settlers and how it came to be. So we'll talk about maybe about that maybe for 10 minutes, and we'll go into the landscapes and the environment and the major shifts that are happening in Australia. So I just want us to look at this, where how Australia, the landmass, came to be. So in 225 million years ago, it was Pangaea, and then slowly the continental drift happened, and present day Australia moved away from the in the Cretaceous period. Australia moved away and to the corner, the down under. And here we have the map of Australia. At this point, I just want everyone to just look at it and see where all the places lie. So we have Western Australia onto the west, the Northern Territory or the Northern Australia, the Southern Australia, South Australia. There's three states now, and we have Queensland here, New South Wales here, and Victoria. So these are the 6 states on the Australian landmass, and then we have Tasmania on the south. It's a small island. So you just keep this in mind, and we'll move to the next slide. So Australia in the 1500s and 1600s was not discovered yet. And during that period, it was an age of discovery. And the people in the Europe, the voyagers and the philosophers, they started thinking. So we have mapped almost all the lands in the world that we know. And there seems to be an imbalance in the sense that the north part of the map seems to remain empty. And to that part, these people, the Europeans, gave a name, Australis, Terra Australis non cognita. That is the southern land yet not known to man. So you can see in the map, the whole Antarctic North Pole region is called the Terra Australia non cognita, the unknown land. And Australis is a term from which Australia emerged, and Australis just means southern, and Terra means earth or land. So this is how the idea or the concept of Australia emerged in the Middle Ages. So as ma'am said, in 1778, the penal colony began in Australia. Before that, in 1600s, the Dutch came to Australia. They landed in the western coast, but they saw that there's nothing much to do here, so they went back. And what forced the Europeans or the British specifically to come to Australia is the revolution, the American Revolution in 1776, where America, which was also in a way penal colony, where the British, the unwanted people from Britain, was sent to America. But when America gained independence, they said, no, we're not going to entertain any more of your convicts. And they were forced to find a place, find a land where they could send their prisoners. And these are just a few information here and there. And Tasmania was known as sorry, there's an error in the spelling. It's Dimien, Van Diemen land, which later became Tasmania. That's also a short information that we can keep in mind. So yeah, here is James Cook, who came to Australia in 1770 in the East Coast, which is now called the Botany Bay. And 17 years later, with 1,400 people, of which 700 plus were convicts, Captain Arthur Phillip landed in Botany Bay. But when they landed in Botany Bay, they found out that it was not as good a land as what James Cook wrote about. And they shifted a bit north and reached the Sydney Cove, which is now called the Sydney Bay. And HMS Endeavour is the ship in which James Cook landed first in Australia. So the picture on the left is an aerial photo of the Botany Bay, and you can see the Sydney airport runway in that image. So James Cook landed here in 1770, and in the second picture, you can see Botany Bay in the bottom. That is where Arthur Phillip also came, but he found out that it was not a viable place, and they moved further up. And you can see the Sydney Opera House there in that small piece of land. He landed there, and that is where the first colony was formed. And as soon as they landed in Australia, what we call Australia, the conflict between with the indigenous people started. So when it's very important to talk about the indigenous people who are called the Aboriginal Australians or the First Nation Australians or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So these terms are very important because the term that was used to note Aboriginals were Aborigine, which is now a bit of a derogatory term, which we should try to avoid. And we can call them Aboriginals, Australian Indigenous people, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So as soon as they landed, these people have been here, were here for 30,000 to 65,000 years ago, since then, and they are the longest continuing culture existing in our world. And the first attack to the Aboriginals was not physical conflict, but what happened? The diseases that the Europeans carried over. So smallpox was one of the biggest weapons that eradicated a major population of Aboriginal people when the Europeans started settling in the land. So which are the major British colonies? So like the 13 colonies of the US, which later became 30 states, we have the 6 + 1, 7 states of Australia, which initially were penal colonies. So in this map, this is a map from 1918. You can see the major penal colonies. Perth was a penal colony, and Victoria, Sydney, Brisbane, and Hobart and Lansdowne in Tasmania were also penal colonies. So it was around these penal colonies, small states came to being, and each state were governed by a governor, a British person who governed the land. So they had complete control of the people who lived there, including convicts as well as people who immigrated from Britain. So what led to the largest intake or immigration of people into Australia was the gold rush. So gold was discovered in New South Wales and Victoria, which led to a massive influx of migrants. So the date was 1850. So 1850s to 1890s, you can see immense migration, especially from China, America, and Ireland, also from other places. And when the 1900s, the 1890s hit, the stockpile of gold started to diminish, and there rose a economic depression from 1890 to 1900. And people were really unhappy. And the people of Australia at that point comprised of convicts who were emancipated and also soldiers who retired and remained in Australia, because at that point, you come to Australia, or if you're a convict and you're emancipated, you get around 30 acres of land, because as Jamila ma'am said in the beginning, land is plenty in Australia. And how did they start thinking about liberation from the British rule? So in 1900s, in 1901, on January 1, the Commonwealth of Australia was declared, and Edmund Barton was the first Prime Minister. And as soon as the Federation or the Commonwealth of Australia was declared, the first rule they brought was White Australia policy. So it's important to look at these major events in Australian history before we go to the rest of our session. So White Australia policy at that point itself, they declared that we are not going to bring any more non-European immigrants into our land. So they were already very strict about non-European immigrants. So we can imagine how they treated the Aboriginals. So as ma'am said in the beginning of the introduction, yes, Aboriginals and Australians always had, or the Europeans always tried to coexist in the beginning. But unfortunately, as more people came in, the conflicts also started to increase. And it was really difficult to create a balance between the white settlers and the Aboriginal people. And this got stronger with the White Australia policy, which generally did not invite anyone from outside Europe. This was specifically meant for the Chinese immigrants. So that is the setting. And now this is the white history of Australia. And as I mentioned in the beginning, Australia already had inhabitants. Australia already had inhabitants who are the Aboriginal people. And when we think about Australia now, we think about a lot of cultural landmarks. We think about the marsupial animals, including kangaroo, and the vast lands. But who really own those lands? So the concept of ownership itself came with the European settlers. So Aboriginals never had the concept of ownership. They had their own belief systems, and which included the land, the nature, and the people, which definitely include the animals, insects, and plant life with it. So there was huge shift when the white settlers came in, and they pushed in advertently or inadvertently the Aboriginals into way I could say non-existence. That I said that because in today's Australian landscape, though Aboriginals are represented, the Aboriginals are recognized, they do not have the voice in the parliament. So voice in the parliament is a struggle, a constant struggle the Aborigines have been trying to reach for over a century now, and we'll come to that in the later part. So this is a short, brief history of how Australia came to being and how the British colony became the Australian Federation, and it became the Commonwealth of Australia. So today we'll look at uh, four landscapes, four iconic landmarks of Australia, and how they have been represented and how they have changed, and who are the real, who are the people who really own, if I can use the term, own or are part of that land. Because whenever a European or a colonial empire comes into a land and takes over that place, they make everything their own. And they will create a narrative where they'll make sure that the people who are there are not equipped or competent enough to keep or hold that land or that culture. So the first place we'll be looking at is Uluru or Ayers Rock. So before I show the image, I think you people, the audience here must have seen this in movies or documentaries, and it was called the Ayers Rock. So that is the English term for uh, the mountainous structure that I'm going to show. And Uluru is the indigenous Aboriginal term. So even the shift up from Ayers Rock to Uluru was after a long battle with the government. So this is Ayers Rock or Uluru. This is significant landmark in Australia, and it has deep cultural and spiritual importance for the Anangu people. Anangu people, I'm sorry, I might be mispronouncing the terms, and yeah, apologies for that. So Anangu people are the original inhabitants of this land. When you look at this land, you can see it's a deserted place. It's just this one big rock, which is actually, the circumference is around 9.4 kilometers. It's huge. And but the indigenous people, they walk a lot, they travel a lot. So what they do is, you can see even in this image, there are places where you have shadow regions. So when they're traveling from long distances, they use these spots to make bread, because they can pick berries and resources from the nature, and they make bread, or they stop a while to rest before they continue the journey. So what happened to Uluru? So Uluru, it became a big tourist site. And even in movies, there are scenes, I think there is in one Tom Cruise movie, there is a scene where Tom Cruise hangs from the Uluru Rock trying to climb it. And it became a huge cultural phenomenon as well. But the original inhabitants, or the Anangu tribe people, they were not happy with what was happening to this place, which is a very important monument in their culture. And after a long protest in 1985, the Australian government declared the Uluru Rock and the area around it as Uluru Kata Tujuta National Park, and the rights were given to the Aborigines. So this we can see throughout Australian history, where land ownership is given to Aboriginals. But what we need to understand is, though they are given the ownership, they're not allowed to do anything on the land. They're not allowed to construct anything. They're not allowed to cultivate. So they cannot do anything with the land. They have the ownership, but the true ownership still remains with the Australian government. So this is the contestation that has been going on for, as I said, for over a century. And here also we can see that example. But the importance is that finally the Australian government recognizes that this is a part of the Aboriginal culture and they have to step back. Though it created immense amount of tourist income for them, they decided to step back. So in 1985, this happened. So here, despite the return of the title deeds, Anangu people face challenges in managing the park and preserving their cultural practices due to the increasing number of visiting tourists. So even though this in 1985, the land title deeds were given to the Aboriginals, the tourists did not stop coming. And this only ended in 2019. So 1985 to 2019, it took such a long period to reach a place where the Anangu people finally got the land for themselves. So this is a photo from 2019 where the Anangu people, they have set a board there, no walkers or climbers, because climbing and walking on the rock, which is a very important spiritual religious rock for the Anangu people, is sacrilegious. So finally in 2019, they were able to permanently close the rock to climbers and tourists. So now if you go to Australia and if you want to see Uluru, you can only stay, I think, a few kilometers away and watch it from a distance. You're not allowed to even go near it. So that is a huge shift and change, which is a progress towards the acceptance and recognition of Aboriginals in Australia. So now the second landmark that we'll be looking at is the Darling Murray Basin. So in this image, you can see the left river, that's Darling River, right river, that's a Darling River, and left it's a Murray River, and they're joining in the confluence. And this is like a snake winding all across eastern Australia, and it's a major water source for a lot of cities. And this is also major water source for a lot of indigenous tribes living, indigenous communities living in Australia. So what happened is, during the initial period of the colonial rule in Australia, they constructed dams, they cut out tributaries from the river, and they mismanaged the basin so much that the water content of the river diminished. And this led to a threat where slowly and with exacerbating climate change events, the Darling Murray Basin would, in 100 years, completely dry off. So in 2012, the government initiated a policy, started a plan to revamp and resurrect the Darling Murray Basin. And the plan was supposed to complete in 2024, but the Australian government has not been able to meet the target, and they have pushed it to 2027, which is a concern to Australians because Australia has been seeing climate events one after the other since the 2000s. And because of a lot of other climatic events, which I'll speak about, are happening around Australia, the chances that the people or the government will be able to retake the basin is less. So the people and communities in Australia are trying to push for a faster resolution to bring back the Darling Murray Basin. Yes. And it's a huge economic factor also, because Australia is a country which its economy is based on agriculture, cattle, including cows and sheep, and fossil fuels. So a river source like this is very important for them, because almost all the agricultural land in Australia benefits from these river from this river basin. Okay. So these are I've already spoken about this. This is what is happening to the river and what they're trying to do. So the plan is called Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and it started in 2012, and it's supposed to complete in 2024, but they still have not completed it. Okay. So now we reached the beautiful, the majestic Great Barrier Reef. So in the map, it's a bit unclear, but you can see where the geographical location of the Great Barrier Reef. It's on the east coast, the northern east coast, and it lies like this. And these are the images, the photos, the plants and animals that exist within the Great Barrier ecosystem. So this is a huge ecosystem, which for us human beings is a marvel to visit, to do a scuba diving and see the animals and plants that live within the ecosystem. But for the creatures that living within the coral reefs, it is a haven. And the problem is that all across the globe, coral reefs are dying. The reason is because, as we all know, global warming. And the global warming is not just the warming of the atmospheric temperature, it's also the warming of the ocean. And the ocean temperature is increasing drastically. So we don't feel this because ocean temperature increase that do not directly affect us, as people who live in cities, who does not live in the coast. But people who live in the coastlines do feel the difference. But for us, most of us, we don't think about it. But the plant life within oceans, even a small, minute degree of variation can affect their existence. It is a live or die situation. So now the next image is this. This is the current situation of over 70 to 90% of coral reefs across the world and 70% of coral reefs in the Great Barrier Reef. So there are a lot of reasons for this. One is, as we know, it's us human beings, the practices that we do. And the other is the bigger impact, the climate change and global warming. And the oceans in and around Australia has been warming at a rapid rate. And this is affecting the coral reefs. So bleaching is basically what happens when the temperature changes. It can be temperature change or the alkalinity, acidity, or the chemical variation within the oceans. The algae, which gives the color to the coral reefs, gets stressed. And these algae will leave the coral. And this will give it the white color. If you have seen a coral, so if you go to Kanyakumari or places like that, you might see you can buy coral from shops. It will be white or a creamish white color. So when the algae leaves, it reaches the creamish white color. That is the bleached coral. So this phenomenon is called coral bleaching. And it is happening all across. So the main dates are 1998, 2002. So in 1998 and 2002, El Nino and El Nino are two weather phenomena which control the atmospheric weather and the oceanic temperature. So in 1998 and 2002, there was this phenomenon, but that was isolated events. But since 2016, this has been a recurring phenomenon. So 2016 we had it, 2017 we had it, and since 2020 we have been having a sustained level of coral bleaching. So this is a huge concern for the Australian government as well, because it's not just that we should conserve the beauty of the coral reefs or the life of the coral reefs. The other major important factor for the Australian government is that it is a huge tourist attraction, and it brings in a lot of money for the Australian government. So there are a lot of emissions and plans to regrow the reefs. So when coral bleaching happens, if it's not too intense or if it's not fatal, the corals can regenerate the algae living in it. So the government is trying to bring that back and to revive the reefs. But the rapid changes in the climate and where we are headed it's unlikely that we will be able to revive the coral reefs as fast as required, because the bleaching is happening at a rapid pace, and the changes are not receding because the climate is changing at a rapid pace as well. So, uh, but we are trying. We are trying our best to bring it back into its older glory. So that is about coral bleaching and how it's affecting the majesty of the coral, the Great Barrier Reef. And another enemy of the corals are cra crown of thorns starfish. It's called crown of thorn because of the shape of the thorns on top of it, which is like the crown worn by Jesus in the story of Bible. And what they prey nearly on all types of corals. So what they do is they come, sit on top of it, and slowly suck the nutrients and life out of it. And it can eat their way through around 10 square meters of it a year. So and yeah, and because of that, the population of crown of thorns starfish is also increasing exponentially. And now the Australian government have started plans to slowly either capture or eradicate these starfishes, because they do not only eat up the ecosystem of the corals, but inadvertently the other beings that live among the corals are also affected. So that is what I want to talk about, the changes in the Great Barrier Reef or the corals. Yes. So yes, now we'll go to the Sydney Opera House, the iconic symbol of Australia that we all, I think almost all of us, when we think about Australia, we think about this particular building or structure. So this is a theater. Basically, this is a theater. In the 1950s, the Australian government, so Sydney was a prominent place in, prominent city in Australia. And there was this, when we think about the capital of Australia, we usually might think about Sydney or Victoria, Queensland, or places like that, Melbourne or Victoria. But there was this tussle between Sydney and Melbourne of becoming the, like, who wants to be the capital, and finally it fell on Canberra. So Canberra is the capital of Australia. Just a little bit of info there, and yeah, we'll back to Sydney Opera House. So the structure of Sydney Opera House is very interesting. So this is in the Sydney Harbour. And in the earlier map I showed, you could see that jutting out of the Sydney Harbour. And the structure of these shell-like pieces, the roof structure, is based on sails of ships or sailboats. So that was the idea behind it. And on the right, you can see an image of how it was during the construction. So the story of Sydney Opera House is also interesting. So in the 1950s, they wanted to have a monument which will stand out, and they set out a competition. Around 200 entries came in from all over the globe, and one was selected, of Jean Utzon. So he was a Danish architect, and the interesting thing is that when he drew the conceptual graph of Sydney Opera House, he had no idea of how to build it, how he was going to build the roof or anything of that sort. So he drew a design and sent it, and that got selected. And that led to a lot of delays at the end. So Jean Utzon is a Danish architect, and in 1959, finally the work began. Even when they began the work, they did not know how they were going to build the roof of the opera house. And the initial budget was $7 million, Australian dollars at that time. And the project was supposed to complete in 1963. But because Utzon did not have any idea or needed more time to find a way to build his design, it went on for a longer period. And the government changed, and the new government was not keen on going on with the project, and they wanted to finish the project as early as possible. And there were conflict or problems between the government and Utzon, and finally Utzon left the project in 1966. he never came back. He did not come back to see the project completed. And the problem was Utsen's initial ideas were left out. And the new architects and the new engineers brought in their own concepts when they completed the Sydney Opera House. So the Sydney Opera House was completed in 1973 and it was opened by Queen Elizabeth II. And the final cost from 7 million came down to $102 million. And Utzon was later in the 1990s brought back by the Australian government, and he was set to oversee the completion of the Sydney Opera House and also to maintain the renovation process. And if I'm not right, Utzon died in 2008. And till date, the renovation as well as the corrections of Sydney Opera House are going on. The corrections, what I mean is, because Utzon left in between, the new architects did the work as they deemed fit. But unfortunately, because of the broader design or the bigger design was Utzon's idea, the new things that were built by the changed architects did not come as planned. And there are problems in the acoustics in the theater. So those things are still under construction. So today, definitely Opera House stands as a monument, as a remarkable building, which everyone who know about Australia can relate to. And today what happens is, whenever they have a very important event, that can be their Australia Day, or as you can see in the image, when the Australian bushfires hit Australia, they uses it as a projecting board and showcases events like this, where during the Black Summer bushfires, they celebrated the firefighters who faced the flames, and their photos were projected on it. So that is where we leave Opera House. Today, symbolically, Opera House is famously unfinished because it's still under construction, and it, as a metaphor, like Australia, like the Sydney Opera House, Australia is also going through a lot of shifts even now. And that brings us, we have like 5 minutes, I think. That brings us to the 50th anniversary of the Opera House. And that coincided with the referendum. So as I mentioned earlier, the Aboriginal people, though they have given title deeds, rights and things like that, they're not part of the the Australian government. So Australian government did not recognize the Aboriginals' membership within the parliament. And the voice to parliament, or the term voice in the Australian context, is very important. So the voice is the indigenous voice to parliament. So in 2017, they tried to bring that into effect. It was called Uluru from the Heart, Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was the First Nations voices in the form of representation within the Australian Constitution. But that failed, that did not go through. And the latest was in 2023, where it was supposed to go to vote in 14th October 2023, and it went, and it did not pass. It did not receive enough votes to pass into the Constitution. So even today, the Aboriginal voice is, we can say, unheard. They are not part of the Constitution. They do not have membership within the Parliament. So when you're talking about Australia, it's very interesting, because in countries like New Zealand or Norway, there are indigenous tribes who still live there and who coexist within the mainstream government or mainstream people. So in Norway, we have Sami people. The Sami people, they have their own way of governance, which is recognized by the the government of Norway. Likewise, in when we come to so in the Sami people, the parliament, they have a parliament and they meet twice a year, and they address all the problems of the people of the Sami population. And likewise, when you come to New Zealand, we have the Maori. Maori also have a parliament. They are also represented, and their problems are also listened and acted upon by the parliament. So representation as well as action is there in these regions. But in Australia, irrespective of the century plus struggle, they have not reached that place. So in that way also the unfinished endeavor of the Sydney Opera House reflects the unfinished journey of the Australian Aborigines.